Before it was recognized as a landmark of queer media, The Price of Salt began with a brief encounter in a department store. Patricia Highsmith was working a holiday shift at Bloomingdale's when a woman in a mink coat approached her counter. Something about the woman lodged itself in Patricia's mind. That moment grew into a story she knew she couldn't publish under her own name, but one she felt compelled to write anyway. This is how the book was born, and today we'll explore the origins of Patricia Highsmith's 1952 book, The Price of Salt, later reissued as Carol. In December 1948, Patricia Highsmith was 27, living in New York and struggling to make ends meet while revising what would become her first novel, Strangers on a Train. To pay rent, she took a temporary job in the toy department at Bloomingdale's. Patricia wasn't happy about it. She later described the store as claustrophobic, crowded, and stifling. But one afternoon, a woman walked in, a glamorous suburban blonde in a mink coat, and she took Pat's breath away. Patricia helped the customer select a doll for her daughter, and then the customer left instructions to send the doll to her home address. In her diary that night, Pat wrote that she felt strangely and overwhelmingly moved. She sketched the woman's features, she imagined her name, and then she became ill, feverish, almost delirious. During that fever, scenes arrived: a shop girl, an older married woman, a road trip. She wrote the first outline in just a few hours, saying later that it felt born under a sort of compulsion. Highsmith had spent years navigating relationships with women whose lives were constrained by marriage, class, or the fear of exposure. She'd been the younger lover, the secret, so she understood the emotional architecture of longing for someone who lived in a world you couldn't fully inhabit. In her notes, Pat emphasized that the love between Carol and Therese had to feel true, not sensationalized, and also not pathological. For the character Carol, Pat drew on her own relationships for inspiration. In particular, she shaped Carol around two of her former lovers, Virginia Kent Catherwood and Catherine Hamill Cohen. In fact, Catherine had an experience of a fraught custody battle over her daughter, brought about by an audio recording during a meetup with a woman at a hotel, a storyline which is pivotal to the plot of The Price of Salt. By the time Pat completed her draft, the book was no longer just a personal fantasy or a fever dream. She'd shaped it into a story that thousands of women would eventually feel seen by. Even as she was writing it, Patricia Highsmith understood the risk she was taking. To write a book about lesbian desire in the late 1940s was one thing, but to defy the conventions that queer characters had to end in misery was something else altogether. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, American queer life was shaped by surveillance, legal, psychiatric, and cultural. Lesbian pulp existed, but it was designed to entertain straight men and punish its protagonists. The unwritten rule of these books was that the lovers must part, die, or convert to heterosexuality. There could be no happily ever after. And even when authors complied with these conventions, books were still seized. Publishers were still prosecuted, and the authors themselves were blacklisted, faced economic ruin, and sometimes surveillance by the FBI. These consequences were the ones Patricia Highsmith understood intimately. Pat had lovers, but secrecy was mandatory. She lived in a world where queer desire was permitted only in private and only at personal risk. During the time she was finishing The Price of Salt, Patricia was becoming known as a crime writer of exceptional ability. Strangers on a Train was published in 1950 and quickly optioned for film by Alfred Hitchcock. The literary establishment was watching. A lesbian love story with a hopeful ending could have detonated her career. And Patricia was ambitious. She wanted recognition, money, respect. But with Strangers on a Train on the precipice of launching the mainstream success of her literary career, she was at a crossroads. Publishing The Price of Salt could cause it all to come crashing down. In the end, she made the only choice she could. She'd invent a pseudonym, Claire Morgan. Under that name, Patricia revised the novel with obsessive care. The emotional truth mattered to her, but so did precision. She avoided explicit descriptions, not out of prudishness, but because she wanted the book to be taken seriously as literature, not pulp. Her belief in the story's integrity bordered on stubbornness. She refused to write a tragic ending. Highsmith wrote the novel quickly, but not easily. She worked on it in secret and told almost no one about it. The first working title was The Bloomingdale Story, then The Argument of Tantalus. She wanted a title that communicated cost. finally landing on the price of salt, a reference she used to suggest cost, consequence, and the difficulty of leaving one life for another. When the book finally appeared in 1952, the response was muted and uneven. Major critics overlooked it, and the publisher, Coward McCann, treated it as a cautious mid-list release. But beneath that quiet reception, something far more consequential was taking place. Highsmith began receiving letters, hundreds of them, from women and men across the country. Clerks, housewives, students, service members, mothers, wives, people who lived two lives, the one they showed the world and the one they felt or lived privately, but didn't often see reflected in books or movies. They wrote that the book was the first time they had seen themselves, that they had been waiting for any story, just one, where queer love did not end in suicide, madness, disgrace, or erasure. One woman wrote, "Your book saved my life." For Highsmith, these letters were both gratifying and unsettling. She was proud, but she also feared exposure. She kept the secrecy the pseudonym allowed her and focused on her career in crime fiction. But the world had already decided the book's place. Queer bookstores kept it in stock for decades. Readers passed copies hand to hand, whispering that there was this book, this one book, with an ending that didn't destroy you. Finally, in 1990, a feminist press convinced Patricia to republish the book with her own name. It was reissued as Carol. Critics reevaluated it not as pulp, but as a landmark of queer modernism. It influenced a generation of LGBTQ+ writers who saw, often for the first time, a portrayal of queer desire without punishment. And then came the 2015 film adaptation Carol, which reframed the novel for a new audience under director Todd Haynes and received a 10-minute standing ovation at Cannes Film Festival. The screenplay for Carol was written by Phyllis Nagy, who actually knew Patricia Highsmith and was able to use that personal knowledge of Pat to shape the story and the characters for the screen in a meaningful way. Decades later, when Pat reread her book, she admitted she initially had underestimated its impact. She called the book a real love story, and one of the few things I've written that still makes me happy. The Price of Salt was born from a brief and non-eventful encounter with a stranger in a department store. But what Pat did with this encounter, spinning a story of queer desire that ends without tragedy, was profound. Because more than 70 years later, we're still talking about it. This has been How the Book Was Born, where we explored the origin story of The Price of Salt, or Carol. Thanks so much for watching, and if you like this kind of deep dive into literary history, like and subscribe for more.